Hello, my wonderful viewers. You are welcome again to another Kavdil ICT lessons. My name is Ernest Atto Bentil. Viewers, in our previous lessons, we started looking at the system unit. What are found at the front of the system unit as well as the components inside the system unit. We have dealt with the power supply unit, the motherboard, we talked about the processor, we looked at the ROM and the RAM in the previous lesson. Today we are continuing that lesson on the system unit, specifically the components inside. There are so many components inside the system unit, so we are treating them one after the other. So today the lesson is still on components inside the system unit. Components inside the system unit. But today we are going to look at the processor again. We talked about the processor in our two previous lessons. Today we will visit the processor again, and then we will look at two additional components that work hand in hand with the processor to ensure that the processor gets a very good working environment inside the system unit. But before we do that, let's mark the assignment you were given on the ROM and the RAM in the previous lesson. 1. Explain why random access memory is considered the main or primary memory of a computer. RAM is considered the main memory because it's the first storage place the processor fetches data for processing. It is considered the main memory because it is the first storage place the processor fetches data for processing. 2. State three differences between RAM and ROM found in the system unit. And 1. RAM is a read-write memory, and then ROM is read-only. We explained that in that lesson. 2. Data on RAM is temporary, while data on ROM is permanent. 3. RAM needs power to retain data, and that makes it volatile. And ROM does not need power to retain data. And last, RAM is easily upgraded. When you have 2 gig, 4 gig, you can upgrade it to 6 gig, 8 gig, 12 gig. So it can be upgraded. And then 4, ROM is difficult to upgrade. So any 3 answers from here, or even those that are not here but are correct, viewers, you are correct. And I believe you all had the answers right. Now let's move to today's topic on still the components inside the system unit. At the end of the lesson, viewers, you'll be able to explain the functions of the following components in the system unit. The first is the processor. As I said, you will revisit the work of the processor again. And then 2, we will look at the function of the heatsink inside the system unit, and then the system fan. When you are using a personal computer, especially like the desktop, you normally hear the sound of a fan working in the system unit. So we are going to look at the functions of these 3: the processor, the heatsink, and then the system fan. Good. Now let's begin the lesson looking again at the processor, the central processing unit. We are revisiting this again because we want to link it to the heatsink and then the system fan, how they help the processor to perform its functions. And viewers, also remember that the processor is one of the most important components in the system unit. The main processing device in a computer is the processor, also called the microprocessor or central processing unit. So that is the main processing device. As a human, the main processing device in our system is our brain. The same way, the main processing device in a computer is the processor. So there is a camera, it captures an image. You see the image here. It will be processed into binary digits, and then it will come out as output on a paper. So the main processing device, remember that the main processing device in the computer is the processor, also called the microprocessor or central processing unit. The processor is the electronic component that interprets and carries out the basic instructions that operate the computer. So the computer cannot work without a processor. And remember that it is an electronic component, meaning it needs power before it can work. It needs power before it can work. So it's an electronic component. And the processor interprets and carries out basic instructions. When you are asked any question, you think about the question first before you voice out the answer or you put down the answer. In the same way, the processor also acts the same way. It interprets and carries out basic instructions that operate the computer. The processor is considered the brain of the computer, as we said the last time. So it is the brain of the computer. We operate using our brain. This is our brain, this is the human brain. And this is the brain of a personal computer known as processor or central processing unit. This is because the processor is where most calculations take place. So if I take a calculator and then I type 150 divided by 3, I expect the processor to give me an answer of 50. And look at how quick these things happen when you are operating a calculator. Very fast. Because the processor is where all calculations take place and they operate at a very fast speed. Last, I explained that most people refer to the whole system unit as CPU. You normally hear people saying that my CPU is not working, my CPU is not working, whereas they are referring to the system unit. So always remember that the processor is a component inside the system unit, as our brain is also a component inside the head. So always refer to these components with their right names. We have the system unit and we have the processor as a component inside the system unit. If my head is aching and I say that my brain is aching, it's just like saying that your CPU is not working, whereas it's the whole system unit that is not working. Maybe the problem with the system unit may not even come from the CPU or the processor. So let's use the right names for the right component. So remember that the CPU is where most calculations take place inside our PCs. There are two major manufacturers that deal with processors, and we talked about the AMD processor and Intel processors. So if you buy a personal computer, whether a laptop or a desktop, you will see a sticker of the processor on the machine, the type of processor that particular machine uses. You will see it. The most common processor found in most machines is the Intel, and you will see a small sticker with Intel written on it at the base of the laptop or on the system unit, telling you that the processor inside this particular machine is an Intel processor. Let's look at some examples of Intel processors. We have the Pentium, and we dealt with Pentium 1, 2, 3, 4 some time ago. We have the Core 2, we have the Intel Xeon, we have Core i3, Core i5, Core i7, you even have Core i9. These are all examples of Intel processors, and as the cores increases, you see that the speed at which these processors work also increase. We also have some examples of AMD. AMD stands for Advanced Micro Devices, and these are some of the examples of AMD processors: the Opteron, the Ryzen, and then the Athlon. They are all examples of AMD processors. They are the brain inside your computer systems. They do all the calculations for you. Whether you are dealing with Excel, whether you are dealing with a presentation software like PowerPoint, Microsoft Word, any graphic designing, they do most of the tasks you handle with your PC. Now we saw Core i3, Core i5, Core i7, Core i9. What is the meaning of the core? A core is a small CPU built into a big CPU or CPU socket. So normally when computers started emerging, we had only one CPU, a single core, only one CPU. Then later, as computers started serving us very efficiently, the need came that the processor will have to work at a high speed or handle multiple tasks at the same time. So the cores were increased. So there's a single core. There's a single core. So if you have two CPUs on a chip, these days you even buy a standard SIM card and you have a micro SIM and a nano SIM inside the same SIM card. In the olden days, we had only, all phones were taking the standard SIM. No nano SIM, no micro SIM. But these days, we have the standard SIM, and on the standard SIM, you have the micro SIM as well as the nano SIM. So if you buy the SIM card, the type of SIM card that your phone uses, you break it out of the standard SIM. The same way, if a CPU comes with two CPUs on one chip, we call it dual core. Dual core. It means that this dual core can do times 2 of what the CPU can do. Times 2. If your CPU comes with 4 CPUs on one chip, we call it quad core. That means that this quad core can do times 4 of what the CPU can do. We also have hexacore. That means 6 CPUs on one chip. That means that it can do 6 times what the single core can do. We have octa-core, meaning 8 CPUs on one SIM or on one chip. And that means that it can do 8 times what the single core can do. And more than 8, we call it multiple core. So these are the kinds of CPUs that we have. So you can have i3, but the i3 may be hexacore. You can have the same i3, but the i3 may be octa-core or quad-core. So it depends on the number of CPUs you have on that single chip. So that is the meaning of the core. Now let's go to the sections of the processor. The sections of the processor. The processor has different sections and they all operate, they all have the kind of work they do to help the CPU better function well in our PCs. The CPU has 3 main logical units. These are arithmetic and logic units, ALU. You have the control unit and then the memory unit. So if you take the CPU, this is the CPU on your screen. You have the ALU, that's the arithmetic and logic unit. You have the CU, that is the control unit. And then you also have the memory unit. So these are the 3 main units of the CPU. Arithmetic and logic unit, control unit, and memory unit. So viewers, let's take them one by one and look at what they all do to help the CPU perform its function. The first one is arithmetic and logic unit, and it's a section where actual data processing takes place. So if, with the example I gave initially, if I type 150 divided by 3, the answer I will get is 50. That task, that calculation is done by the ALU. So when it comes to ALU, all calculations, be it addition, subtraction, division, and multiplication, occur here. That is where all our calculations take place, the arithmetic and logic units. All additions, all subtractions, divisions, and multiplication, they occur here. When it comes to the logic operations, we have arithmetic and logic units. So the arithmetic takes care of all the calculations. And the logic also do comparison. So it determines if two numbers are equal, if one number is greater than or less than the other. So if I'm working with Excel and I generate a chart for a data, that is the work of the logic unit. So they do these comparisons, because when you have a bar chart or histogram, you see that the data will be represented by bars, and the length of the bars will not be equal, and the meaning will be translated under the chart. So these are the work the arithmetic and logic unit does for the CPU. They do calculations and they do reasoning, logical reasonings for us. The control unit, that is the CU, acts as a manager directing all the processor's activities. If we say that somebody is a manager in our local work settings, if I enter a bank, I will find a manager there, and the manager directs all activities at the bank. Nothing goes on at the bank without the knowledge of the manager. The same way, when you go to our schools, at the basic schools, you get the head teacher there. The head teacher will be there, and the head teacher will have some staff of teachers under the head teacher, and nothing will go on in the school without the knowledge of the head teacher. The same applies to the SHS. So when you say something is a manager, it means you control everything that happens within your jurisdiction or environment. That is what the control unit does. Any information that gets to the processor or data, they will assess it first, and then they will look at what must be done to this data. It also manages the flow of information through the processor. So if I give some work to the processor to do, then I follow that work with another one, with another one, with another one. The control unit will make sure that the processor will get the work at the time the processor is free to process that data. So they control the flow of information. The processor, since they have multiple cores, one of the cores will get information or data, process it, release it to the RAM, and then another will enter. This flow, the systematic flow of information or data, is done by the control unit. The control unit also takes information from the memory and decodes them. We did in our previous lesson, or we learned in our previous lesson, that we understand the characters on our keyboard, but any data that we give to the computer, it converts them into binary digits. So any information or data that is fed into the processor, the control unit will decode it. That is, give meaning to that data before the control unit will know that, oh, the user wants me to do some addition, the user wants me to do some multiplication, and then it will forward it to the right cortex of the processor. And based on the instructions, it tells the ALU how to operate, what to operate on, and then what to do with the result. Even in mathematics, we have something we call board mass. When you are doing some calculations, there are some rules that you have to follow. So the board mass will guide you on the first thing to tackle first before you can get the right answer. That is the same way the control unit also, that based on the instruction, it will direct the ALU how to operate, what to operate on, and what to do with the results. Good. Now let's get to the memory of the processor. The memory of the processor. We said we have ALU, we have control unit, and then the memory. The central processing unit has its own embedded memories that stores data temporarily while processing data. These memories are cache memory and register. The processor also contains some kind of memory, and we call that memory cache register. Cache and then the register. When we talk about the cache, we said that when we're treating RAM, that the RAM picks information from the hard drive or the SSD, and then it will give it to the processor. The processor is responsible for performing a lot of calculations. So maybe the information on the RAM being given to the processor must wait for some time before processing begins. So where would the processor keep this data awaiting processing? It will go to the memory of the processor called the cache. And then we also have the register. So the cache memory stores copies of data and instructions from the RAM that is waiting to be used by the processor. So this is the RAM. It will give information or data to the CPU, but it will first go to the cache first. If the CPU is free to process that data, then the information or data will move from the cache to the CPU. Other than that, the CPU can crash because the CPU may be processing a data and another data will just come. That may cause the CPU to crash. So if data is released from the RAM, it will go to the cache. The control unit will make sure that, oh, the CPU is free now. Then the information or data will move from the cache to the CPU for processing. So there's an internal memory inside the processor, and we call that cache. The cache stores copies of data and instructions from the RAM that is waiting to be used by the CPU. When the CPU needs any data, it will first check the cache memory before going to the RAM. So if any data moves from the RAM to the CPU, it will go and rest in the cache. Then when the CPU is free, the data will move to the CPU. So when the CPU is looking for any data, it will go to the cache first. Let me check my memory first. If there's nothing there before it goes to the RAM to pick any data. So the CPU first look on its own memory first before going to the RAM. So that is what the cache do. And then when it comes to the register, it is the memory that is the smallest and fastest in the computer. The cache memory, the register memory is the smallest and fastest memory in a computer. Why? Because the registers hold instructions that the CPU is currently processing. So when the processor is handling any data, that data must be stored somewhere for the processor to operate on. And that place is called the registers. I gave this example that when you put food in your mouth, that must be chewed before you can swallow. Your tongue helps you to hold the food whilst you are chewing. You cannot just swallow any hard thing straight away. It may choke you. So the tongue is there to hold the food for you as you chew. In the same way, the registers hold data and instructions for the CPU as processing is currently going on. As for the cache, they store the information or data. When the CPU is free, they hand over. But when they hand over, the registers also hold the instructions or the data for the CPU whilst the processing is going on. So immediately the processing is done, the register will hand it over to the cache, and the cache will also hand it over to the RAM, and then it will go to the hard disk or the pen drive or the memory card. So that is the work of these two memories found in the central processing unit. Now let's go to the functions of the processor. The functions. The four primary functions of the processor. The first one is to fetch information from the RAM. That's the first function of the processor, to fetch information from the RAM or take information from the RAM. The second one is to decode, give meaning to the information. The processor receives data. What am I to do with this data? Am I to do any calculation Am I to do any comparison? Am I to do any sort of work on this data? It will decode and then give meaning to the data that is coming to the processor. And then after giving meaning to it and knowing what to do with the data, it will execute. That is, processing will take place. It will execute, and when it finishes, it will store on the cache, and the cache will give it to the RAM, and then it will go permanently on a secondary storage media like the hard disk. So these are the four main functions of the processor: to decode, to fetch, to decode, to execute, and store. So it starts from fetch, decode, execute, and then store. And this is what we call instruction cycle. The processor goes through this cycle all the time. So we call this instruction cycle. Now let's get to speed. Anytime you buy a new PC, you right click on the My Computer icon and then you go to properties. It will give you the speed of your processor. When we talk about speed of the processor, what does it mean? The speed is the number of instructions per cycle or per second the computer executes. This is what we call instruction cycle. And the speed is the number of the cycles that the processor can perform in a second. The number of cycles it can perform in a second. And the CPU speed is measured in megahertz and gigahertz. They are measured in megahertz and gigahertz. These days, all the machines that we have these days have the speed of gigahertz. So when we talk about gigahertz, what does it mean? Gigahertz means 1 billion cycle per second. 1 billion cycles per second. So this is the cycle we are talking about. To fetch, to decode, execute, and store. Fetch, decode, execute, and store. The instruction cycle. So if a processor comes with 3.5 gigahertz, that means that processor can perform these functions individually for 3.5 billion times in a second. So 3.5 gigahertz means that the processor can go through this cycle 3.5 billion in a second, and it's very quick. 3.5 billion. So it can fetch, decode, execute, fetch, decode, execute, store. That cycle can happen 3.5 billion times in a second. You just type any big figure on the calculator and then press equal to. Then you get your answer. Look at how quick the processor performs. And we are saying that it can perform this cycle 3.5 billion times in a second. That is very quick. So that is the meaning of the processor speed. So if you have 1.5, then it means that it can go through this cycle 1.5 billion times in a second. If you have 2.5, then it will go through this cycle 2.5 billion times in a second. So the more gigahertz that you have, the more speed your processor works. So that is the meaning of the speed of a processor. It is normally measured in gigahertz and megahertz. When we talk about megahertz, we are talking about 1 million cycles, just like the megabytes and the gigabytes. And when we talk about the gigahertz, it's 1 billion cycle per second. Now we have talked about the processor. Let's talk about another component that helps the processor to perform its function. And we call that component heatsink. Heatsink. So what is heatsink? A heatsink is a piece of metal that sits on top of the computer CPU and draws away heat from its components by letting it rise through a set of fins. So viewers, you have the processor here. You have the processor here. And as the processor works, it generates some heat. as the processor works, it generates some heat. Sometimes as individual, especially when you are writing mathematics exam and you have to do a lot of thinking, you see that your head will be warm because the brain will be working. The same way, when the processor is working at gigahertz, as we said, billion cycles in a second, the processor will be working at a very fast speed. And because of that, the processor, because it's also an electronic component, it generates some heat. So if the heat is accumulated inside the processor, it can catch fire, and then your system unit you will see something burning inside because of the heat accumulated by the processor. So the heat sink is designed to draw the heat from the processor as it does its work. So that's the main function of the heat sink. They sit on top of the computer CPU and they draw away every heat generated by the processor. So that is the heat sink. So you see some heat here coming out of the processor. You see some heat coming out of the being absorbed by the heat sink. And there's the heat sink. And this heat sink is made up of fins. So the straight bars that you see here is what we call the fins. The straight bars you see here. If you take the circular one, you see some bars here. These are what we call the fins. So all the heat passes through the fins. They take the heat from the processor and it passes through the fins. The fins help increase the surface area for the heat transfer, reducing the heat accumulation at the base. So assuming there were no fins, but there's just one piece of metal without fins, it will become very hot because all the heat will be accumulated at the base. But because of the fins, you see that every fin has a space here. From every fin you see a space. So cool air will be passing through these spaces so that heat will not be accumulated. And it also broadens the heat. It makes the heat broad so that it can pass through most of these fins. Assuming these fins were not there, all the heat will be accumulated in one piece of metal and coming out will be very difficult coming out. But because these fins are provided and there are some ventilations provided inside these fins, you see that there will be cool air as the heat also passes through the fins. So the fins help increase the surface area for the heat. The heat can pass through many places. You see a lot of fins here, both here and here. So that makes the surface area for the heat broad so that they can all come out. Good. Now we know the function of the heat sink. They draws out heat from the processor. Now what about the fan? As the heat sink draws the heat from the processor, the fan also blows the heat away, as you see. So a computer fan is any fan inside the system unit used for active cooling. So it makes sure that inside the system unit, the heat that is generated by the CPU, the heatsink draws the heat and the fan will blow it away. So when you are using a desktop, some time or occasionally you hear the sound of a fan inside the system unit, and sometimes you even feel warm air passing by your feet or legs because the fan occasionally blows out the heat from the system unit to ensure a cool environment for the operation of the CPU. So as the heat sink, you see the heat, the blue arrows, you see the heat. As the heat sink draws the heat from the processor, the fan also blows it away. So viewers, that is the real setup in the system unit. So when you open a system unit, this is what you find. So this is the heat sink, and then on top of the heat sink is the fan, and this heat sink is on the processor. It's on the processor, so it will draw the heat from the processor and the fan will blow it away. So if your fan stops working, your system unit can catch fire because the heat will be accumulated inside the system unit and it may blow. That is the main reason why computers require a cool environment. Whether you give it a proper ventilation or you can fix an air condition inside the rooms where you are using the computer, because of the heat generated by the processor. If the heat accumulates inside the system unit or in the room, it may affect the performance of the computers. So that is why we always advise that you use computers in an air-conditioned room or in at a very cool place, so that the heat generated by the CPU will be reduced by the working of the air condition. So that is the function of the heatsink and the fan. That's the help they provide to the system unit or the processor inside the system unit. System fans are used to draw cool air into the system unit. So as the fans take out the heat, you see that cool air will be entering the spaces in between the fans. They also expel or remove warm air from inside the system unit, and they move air across the heat sink to cool the processor. So the fan is very important when the computer is in use. The fan is very important. It blows away every heat drawn out by the heat sink, so that the processor will always get a very cool environment to operate in. Now viewers, we are gradually coming to the end of the lesson, and today we looked at the system unit and some component found inside the system unit. We talked about the processor, we talked about the heat sink, and then we talked about the system fan. And I believe today you'll be able to understand the functions these three components play inside the system unit. Now, in simple terms, the processor produces heat when performing its work. The heat sink draws the heat from the processor. The system fan then blows the heat away to ensure a cool working environment. So the processor produces heat when performing its work. The heat sink draws the heat from the processor, and the system fan blows the heat away to ensure a cool working environment. So this is the function of these three components found inside the system unit. Now, as usual, let's test ourselves before we leave on this lesson. 1. The brain of any computer system is we have memory unit, ALU, and then CPU. Memory unit, ALU, and then CPU. Good. The answer is CPU. That's the processor. Is the brain of any computer system. 2. The ALU of a computer responds to the commands coming from the ALU of a computer responds to the commands coming from you have the control unit, you have the RAM, and then you have the cache. Good, the control unit. So the ALU take commands from the control unit, because the control unit acts as a manager of the CPU. 3. A device inside the system unit used for active cooling is the device inside the system unit used for active cooling is you have the heat sink, you have system fan, and then you have the cache. Good, the system fan. So the system fan ensures active cooling in the system unit. 4. A device used to remove heat from the processor and disperse it into the surrounding air is called a device used to remove heat from the processor and disperse it into the surrounding air is called, you have control units, you have heat sink, and you have air blower. Good. The answer is heat sink. So the heat sink removes heat from the system unit. 5. The process of obtaining a program instruction or data from the memory is called the process of obtaining a program instruction or data from memory is called. So we said the CPU has 4 main functions, and which one takes information or data or instruction from the memory, that is the RAM. So we have decoding, we have fetching, we have executing. Good. The answer is fetching. The answer is fetching. Good. Viewers, we have all done well, and I believe you have understood the function of the CPU, the heatsink, and the system fan. Now, before we leave, let's take this assignment. 1. Explain why the processor of a computer is referred to as the brain of the computer. Explain why the processor of a computer is referred to as the brain of the computer. And then 2. What is the relationship between the heatsink and the system fan? What is the relationship between the heatsink and the system fan? Viewers, I'll give you some few minutes to put this assignment down. So you explain why the processor of a computer is referred to as the brain of the computer. And you also explain the relationship between the heatsink and the system fan. Hello viewers, you are welcome back. I believe you were able to put the assignment down. Today we looked at some components inside the system unit, specifically the CPU, the heatsink, and the system fan, and the relationship among these 3 components inside the system unit. The CPU does all the calculations in the system unit, and during the calculation it produces some heat. The heatsink draws the heat away from the processor, and the system fan blows it away. So they all have their specific functions they perform. I believe you enjoyed the lesson and you have learned something today. Until I come your way again with another ICT lesson, this is your instructor, Ernest Atobento. Bye-bye.